Hey everybody, this is Aubrey Chavez from Faith Matters. We're excited to share with you this interview with George Handley, a professor of humanities at BYU. George recently published a fascinating and moving intellectual biography about Lowell Bennion. And as we've learned more about Bennion, he's begun to loom large for us as a truly inspiring figure who models some of the best of what our faith tradition has to offer. He was an educator, humanitarian, and practical philosopher who had an outsized impact on the church in the 20th century, even if few might recognize his name today. Lowell Bennion was both committed to intellectual integrity and to prioritizing people over ideas. And in this interview, George walks us through how this dual commitment led Lowell to a heart-led vocation that refused to compartmentalize the gospel, to separate it from either intellectual inquiry or from the practical everyday needs of society. It also meant that Bennion sustained leaders by speaking up when he saw something that felt wrong. And it allowed him to navigate bumpy moments in relationships with other thinkers and educators and leaders in the church with love and integrity. His list of projects is really extensive, but among the most memorable are his founding of the Institute of Religion next to the University of Utah, and of a boys' ranch in Idaho, the Bennion Teton Boys Ranch, where George spent time as a boy. As an educator, Bennion took an expansive view of the gospel that sought to blend itself with secular learning and embrace all truth, even on the occasions when those who disagreed with this approach made decisions that cost him professionally. Bennion was committed to seeing these events as part of the adventure of life. Lowell Bennion's life invites us to consider not just what correct beliefs are, but most especially what those beliefs are for and how they can be turned to the service of humanity. We're so thankful to George for taking the time to bring the life of this impactful, if understated thinker to our attention through this book. And as always, we're so grateful to you for listening, and we really hope that you enjoyed this conversation.
Well, George, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to have you.
Oh, I'm thrilled. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course, yeah. We loved this book. Lowell Bennion he's a name that for me has been sort of circulating, for several years. But I've never done at least the deep dive that your book enabled until now, and it was really moving and fascinating in a lot of ways. You opened sharing a little bit with why Lowell Bennion and his story are personal and important to you, which I thought which moved me. Would you mind sharing with our listeners what it is about his story that is personal for you?
Yeah, I'd love to. I don't claim to have been an intimate of Lowell's. I was one of many who were influenced by him, but I was a boy at a camp that he ran in Idaho in the Teton Valley, which was known as the Bennion's Boys Ranch at the time. And, as a boy, I knew who he was. I knew he had been a professor of my parents, and they loved him, and that was why they thought to send me and my brothers there. But later, when I was 18 and 19, the last summer of high school and the summer after my freshman year of college, I was a camp counselor for him. And so I worked much more closely with him, and I worked with a group of counselors who were, roughly my age, including one of his grandsons. And I became fast friends with that group of young men, but also we were all kind of united in our adoration of Lowell and our appreciation for who he was. And, I ended up reading everything I could get my hands on by him over the course of my college life as a result. And my friends and I fancied ourselves as sort of, trying to build a conversation among ourselves that modeled a lot of what he represented. But, the focus on service and work at the ranch was evident in everything we did. And his discipleship of Christ was evident in everything he ever did or in any way he interacted with us. So I felt I was just drawn to him. I was inspired by him. And, but he wasn't like the kind of person who you might feel drawn to, but he wasn't so eager to be a guru for anybody. And he was so practical and so focused on work that needed to be done that he was not one for long conversations, touchy-feely stuff.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So it wasn't a kind of, closeness that I felt with him so much as a just an intense admiration and appreciation for who he was. Those were foundational summers of my life. I mean, that's without question for
me. I love that.
Yeah, I'm sure. You talk about how he was known as was it Eugene England that said he was the practical philosopher? And you see that through I mean, in every context of his life, he's constantly wrangling theology into some sort of actionable moral decision or like thing that can be done. And so he's such a thinker, but it's never useless. And I think you say in the very beginning that he's just uninterested in abstract theology unless it leads to some sort of moral action. And so I love that he, for you, is just this symbol of service and actual discipleship. Because for me, like, that was the thing that I learned about him. What I knew about him was that he was a thinker and a writer, and he had all these ideas that were so big. And this book was really exciting to see the way that he actually lived all of these ideas that he was always wrestling with.
Yeah, it's really rare to find somebody who's a thinker at that level for so long, and who's so well trained and educated, so well read, and who writes for a living, who is not actually all that interested in the primacy of ideas. Yeah, right? I mean, it's pretty difficult for most of us in that realm, in academia and in the world of ideas, to forget that the stakes aren't that high in getting your ideas right or in arguing with other people. And I think he just worried intensely about the way in which not only intellectual life but religious life can promote concepts over practices, right? And that can lead people to expend enormous amounts of energy that's entirely wasted on trying to make sure that either themselves or other people are thinking correctly, right? Yes. And as much as truth and true ideas matter, they matter because of what they can, enable in us, right? And so if the focus wasn't on that application, that enabling power of ideas to change our lives, then he was wary, right? Even good and true ideas can become useless in the way in which they are just used to justify pride or justify tribalism or to justify inaction in the face of suffering, right? Yeah. So that's why he was always bringing students out of the classroom and into homes of people who were desperate and asked them to serve them. So
that's so unique and so important. And yet you say early on that to some extent, well, largely today, that his teachings are sort of forgotten, or we're not remembering them. Why do you think that is, and what are we missing out on by not remembering more about what he wrote and what he did?
Yeah, it's hard to know for sure. I mean, I have a bit of a theory that there's a slight break or rupture in Mormon thought, as it were, that maybe happens in the sort of 1990s, maybe, that there was sort of, especially, I mean, I'm speaking maybe most internally to my experience at BYU, but there was a real turn when I arrived at BYU to professionalization in academia. And that sort of meant that we turned away from all things, Mormon, right? And so there was almost a little bit of a sense of shame or embarrassment about local thinkers, local writers, because they seemed, I guess, to some people parochial and sort of limited in their their reach, but also maybe limited in their abilities, right, or their value. And so I think there was a turning away for a while of that tradition that we had inherited. I think that's changing now. I mean, I think there's this great turn back. This book series is part of that, but I think there's a great sense of rescue of people like Gene England and Lowell Bennion, and I think there'll be many more to come that we reevaluate in light of our contemporary circumstances and say, maybe James Talmage has something to offer us, John Widsoe has something to offer us that we didn't think of before.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is that, and maybe this is a more cynical explanation, and I don't want to I'm not sure I'm completely committed to it, but he said, he criticized the practice of what he called churchianity versus Christianity. Yeah. And I think he was very wary of religious practice that got too focused on itself for its own sake. And I think we're a little guilty of that. I think we have often, and I think church leaders have actually been aware of that, right? I think that's one reason why we've seen such a tremendous shift away from the 3-hour church and so many activities and so, in my day it was road shows and all the other things. And saying let's get back to the fundamentals. And I think that's what Lowell was always preaching. But that's a little hard to hear and appreciate when you're so busy focused on the institutional practices of programs and events and so on that you're planning and working on as a lay church member. And so when he starts calling, as he always was, calling us into the community, I think to a lot of Latter-day Saints, that sounds like that's more work. You're asking me to do more service than I'm already giving, and I'm already maxed out. Like I don't have any room left. So let somebody else worry about that, right? And so there's a tendency for us to just say that's too much, So I don't, and I don't know, I don't really have any explanation for why he's not cited. I mean, in like general conference talks and so on, although we're our church leaders are pretty modest in terms of who they cite,
right?
Right, and wary that maybe if they do that gets undue attention, to like, oh, now we've got to go all read everything by this person because this is now the person held up as the model.
Yeah.
But I hear his ideas. I certainly hear a lot of them echoed in a lot of things church leaders say, but he's just not given that institutional imprimatur that I wish he had. He did enjoy it for many decades, but that kind of changed towards the end of his life.
Yeah. You talk about is he the only person who's spoken in general conference? Is that he's the only?
As far as I know, he was invited twice to speak in general conference as a non-general authority. And he was, quite close with David O. McKay, which is probably the reason for that. And the two talks, one was on marriage and courtship, and the other is on sort of service and practical Christianity. And he was a very inspiring, dynamic speaker. So there's no question that he was an obvious candidate for that reason. But it is a little bit unusual, right?
Yeah.
To give him that much of a microphone.
It kind of was a model.
Yeah.
So one of the first most interesting things to me about his life and sort of some of the wrestles that he was engaged in very explicitly and like in a public enough way that we can read about it now is this idea of intellectualism versus religious belief. And it's interesting to me, I think, because it feels to me more like that can be an undercurrent sometimes now, but it's not something that we're debating so explicitly like he was with actual church leaders. And so it's great to be able to read his arguments and the counter arguments and recognize ways that, we may be resonating with one side or another. And so I would love for you to just talk about the way maybe he was personally wrestling with this idea that those two camps are at odds and maybe how he reconciled it within himself, but also with broader church leadership, because it feels like this is a way that he's actually really influenced our culture widely. Yeah. I feel like we feel the ripples of the arguments that he was making.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, he was very successful in sort of persuading the church and church members at large of his ideas, because there's a lot of it that's still with us. Specifically, right, he saw the restored gospel as embracing all truth, and he was as a professor of students in college, his main concern was, and his main charge from the church was, help these kids stay in the church, right? Mm-hmm. And so he felt very strongly that in order for students to have a sustainable faith, they had to find ways to connect their faith and the doctrines of the church to the ideas and values and questions that were being posed to them in all of the disciplines they were exposed to. That there is danger in his mind in compartmentalizing and protecting the purity of the doctrine against the sort of wickedness of the secular world, not because there is no wickedness in the secular world, but because if you over-police that boundary, you kind of strangle your own faith, right? Because then a student who doesn't have any way to integrate ends up compartmentalizing everything. So you go to your institute classes and you learn doctrine, and then you go to your sociology class, or you go to your political science class or your philosophy class, and you learn other things. Mm-hmm. And you think, well, never the twain shall meet. I have no idea how these things connect. And then at some point, when they start to sound mutually exclusive, right, then that forces a choice, right? And the student either says, I'm going to turn away from all learning of all kinds, and I'm going to stick with my tradition, but my tradition is going to be impoverished as a result, or I'm going to, head off and leave, right? And so he wanted that integration, and he felt like the Institute was a really ideal place for that integration to happen. And I mean, I think that happens in our church in many settings, but I don't think it happens to the degree that he wanted it to happen. And I do think we still tend to be overly policing that boundary and over worrying the question of the sort of secular influence in, sort of contaminating the purity of the gospel, when we should be advocating a vision that says your mission, because if you look at section 88, when it talks about the current affairs and geology and all the things that we're supposed to be learning, it's so that we're better able to do the work of restoration. Like, it's so we're better equipped to be disciples in the church. So it's not mutually exclusive at all. And so that was what he wanted. He wanted his students to feel that sense of adventure and excitement that as a Latter-day Saint, I have this charge to learn and to go and do, right? To go and make a difference in the world.
I'm trying to think what the sort of like Steelman argument is for strongly policing that right line divider between sort of like secular learning and, gospel principle and doctrine. And I think there is an idea out there that there should be contamination, but it should be one-way contamination. Like those gospel principles should contaminate everything else that we're doing out in the world, but the world should not be contaminating the gospel principles. And I think the reason for that is that we're saying the gospel principles have come by revelation, and like, this is, maybe I'm straying away from Steelmanning here, but I think there's an idea that it is by divine dictation, and therefore we have no right to let anything else contaminate those gospel principles. So yes, like, let's take that and push it out into the world, but we need to protect it from the world at all costs. Do you know what I mean? It's
unfortunate that and I'm the one who introduced the metaphor of contamination, but it's it's unfortunate that we think of it only in those terms, right? Where it's not like opportunity or exploration or expansiveness that might happen as a result, of our contact with ideas in the world. At least that's what, as a humanities professor at BYU, I always try to, teach my students that this is exciting. This is an adventure. We, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we're trying to restore all truth. So it's an exciting opportunity to use the words of Mormon, to lay hold of every good thing, right? And there's lots of good things out there, right? And so that's your charge. It's not to just, what is the phrase in Doctrine and Covenants, to cleave unto all good and forsake all evil. So it's a two-edged process. It's not just forsaking evil. And so I have to be sort of engaged in that exciting gathering rather than defensiveness. But I didn't quite answer your question. Tell me again.
Well, just like, are we sure that we shouldn't protect gospel principle as it's been received because we received it in its purity?
Well, Lowell certainly believed that in the primacy of revelation, right? I mean, he was fundamentally committed to the scriptures. He was fundamentally to reading them and to the words of living prophets, and was fundamentally committed to the restoration of the gospel. But so in that sense, it did have primacy, but he qualified it only in this way, by saying that we cannot be naive to imagine that our interpretation of scripture, of revelation, is totally neutral, right? And it is itself pure in some sense, that it's not, again, I'm using negative terms, but infected by or tinged by the ambiance of our moment in time and place, right? I'm an American in the 21st century. I'm a white male. I speak English. How is it possible for me to interpret the restored gospel in ways that are entirely separate from those factors? And that's not to say that those override and determine everything, and that I should, somehow, shun who I am. He advocated a kind of self-awareness, right? Where I am aware that I am reading scriptures with certain questions because of my time and my place. And some of those questions might be keys to getting me forward, getting us forward to a better place, some of those questions might be limited because I'm not asking enough, right? I'm not broad enough in my thinking to ask new questions, to bring out new insights. So that's why he had a very elaborate, well, it's not so much elaborate as just beautiful and elegant explanation for what revelation is, how it works. And he always quoted section 1 in the Doctrine and Covenants to say that God is always speaking to us in our language.
In our language.
In our understanding. Yeah. And he certainly has capacity to speak beyond that understanding and language, but we're limited in terms of what we're able to receive from him because of our cultural conditioning, right? Yeah. So everybody has to acknowledge that. So when you protect the purity of something, whose purity is it exactly that we're protecting is sort of the question he's raising.
Yeah, and maybe we should do that reading that you found.
Yeah, I mean,
we've kind of talked Revelation, but
we've kind of talked all around it.
I think,
this is our favorite part. Discernment in both contexts, in the context of Scripture, revelation through Scripture, and also revelation through authority, through leaders. Mm-hmm. And he seemed to have a very coherent worldview about discernment. That like so much of this process is about personal discernment. And
sorry, I didn't.
No, I'm good. That was it.
I just wanted to say, like, I think it is probably a false paradigm to draw that bright dividing line, and on this side is purity, and on this side is impurity. Because, like you just said, on the purity side, the gospel principle side, there is a lot of impurity introduced by our own context, our own limited thinking, our own language. And maybe impurity is not the right term because it is all part of this process of growth and learning. But on the other side of the line too, I would imagine you working in the humanities for so long, you've seen that those aren't just necessarily even good ideas. Like I think one of the beautiful things about Mormonism is that we embrace a lot of that as not just good, but divinely inspired and well outside of our tradition. And so that border, that bright line dividing border that we've defined sort of dissolves because there is a lot of impurity on both sides. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, maybe the best example, which I talk about in the book, is, the teaching that Joseph F. Smith and others or Joseph Fielding Smith, and others were advocating that the world was only 6,000 years old, right? And he was willing to ask questions about that and say, look, if you're going to take this hard position and say that all of geology is a threat to the faith of our students, that in itself will be a threat to their students' faith because it's going to put them in a position. His own son was a student of geology. And so he asked Joseph Fielding Smith, help me. I am teaching my son in this way, and help me understand what's wrong with what I'm doing. And he basically was saying, I'm not telling my son or any of my students that they should disrespect revelation. What I'm telling them is that revelation is intended for moral conditioning of human beings and isn't an explanation for how the world works or how old it is or anything of that sort. And so I'm actually agnostic about geology. I'm not saying I know by virtue of being a Latter-day Saint what the right answer is about how old the earth is. I'm letting that be the judgment of geologists. And that's actually, again, where church leaders eventually came out in that way, right? To say we're not taking opinions on that. We leave that to the scientists, and we welcome Latter-day Saints to view those things independently. Because that's again more sustainable over time. He was worried that this was sort of painting kids into a corner and saying you've got to choose between a 6,000-year-old Earth or science and no gospel, right?
Yes. Yeah, totally.
No church, and he didn't want that false choice.
Do you want to do that reading?
Okay, sure. To keep students engaged with the LDS Church and its doctrines, Bennion was intent on presenting them with an expansive rather than restrictive faith. He worried, contra Clark, referring to J. Reuben Clark, that if spiritual knowledge was over-sponsored or its distinctions from secular knowledge were overstated, believers would paint themselves into theological corners that could contradict empirical reality and lived experience. Because revelation in LDS theology is continuous, he chose to emphasize the unending and dialogic nature of revelation. Revelation is a response to man's thinking in man's language. It's not all divine dictation.
Yeah. I love that. I love that thinking. And I think it does really in a very direct sense, but also a subtle sense, it does protect faith. You're not needing to necessarily sort of like add stacks of things to it. The metaphor that people have been using for 10 plus years is the shelf, right? And you're not just adding additional weight to the shelf with every time there's a seeming contradiction between secular scientific learning and revelatory learning. It's sort of like the shelf doesn't even exist because you're very open to whatever you might learn next.
Yeah.
And eventually the shelf will collapse.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was why he wanted that integration, right?
Yeah.
We need the space and the opportunity to explore, to figure out how that integration looks, what it looks like, whether it works, and that's tricky. And that means we have to sort of be patient and engaged in dialogue with one another in honest communication and trust that, if you come up with a theory of how you reconcile evolution with the restored gospel, and I come up with a different theory, and turns out both of us are wrong. We've enjoyed the conversation, we've engaged in something that's interesting, but it's not essential to our salvation. It's not something that we need to become divided over, right? But it is something that we need space to explore and play, right? To figure out how these things work together.
Yeah.
And you say that sort of as a church community and institution even, we've sort of been getting there, or like in many ways these ideas have won out. But and I wouldn't quite say that, that's too strong a term, but I think, we're getting there. Was there significant pushback on Lowell Bennion during his lifetime? Were these difficult ideas for him to promulgate? And was he receiving backlash for this type of thinking?
Well, yes and no. I mean, he was, like I said, he was close with David O. McKay. John Widtsoe, before he passed away, had personally sort of picked him, as the guy he wanted to head up the institute at the University of Utah. His father had been friends with general authorities. He was a very well respected and trusted man. But he asked honest questions about the ban on the priesthood for men of African descent. He asked questions about geology and other kinds of things, not in an effort to try to shame the church or to embarrass a church leader, but because he wanted honestly to get answers that would work for his students. And I think Ernest Wilkinson, who at the time later became not only president of BYU, but he was church education commissioner at the same time. So he was over the whole CES program. And because Lowell was at the Institute, he was Lowell's boss, and he had differences of opinion with Lowell on a number of issues, philosophical and ideological, but also bureaucratic. He wanted college credit for Institute classes, and Lowell didn't want to do that. And that was one thing that they never reconciled. But it appears that Ernie Wilkinson, was successful in getting Lowell removed from his position as Institute director in the early 1960s. And Lowell never got an adequate answer as to why. He asked and never got one. So that hurt. But it didn't stop him. I mean, this is one of the things that I think is really important to understand about Lowell, is that he did not carry that as some cross. He didn't want to be anyone's martyr. A lot of students and former students started writing the church in protest, and he was very uncomfortable becoming sort of a cause. And even late in his life, when his biography was written and a lot of the details of that story came out, he was very concerned that the story of his life would be too shaped around that particular incident. Because in his journey as a disciple, it didn't disturb his journey in the slightest, in the sense that it didn't distract him from what mattered to him. He did. I mean, it was obviously a painful enough moment that he reported a vision of Jesus at the foot of his bed shortly after this happened. So he must have been in considerable angst and agony about what had happened. But it also anchored him, and he went forward. He continued to work in student life at BYU or at the University of Utah, and taught sociology, and then spent the last 15 years of his life working in humanitarian work in Salt Lake City. And he was thrilled. He said, I used to teach religion, now I get to practice it 24/7. So he felt like his life had been a great adventure, and yet that seemed to be sort of the defining story. So I guess what I'm saying is that I don't think There was clearly, I'm sure Joseph Fielding Smith was not thrilled with the questions he posed to him. Mark E. Peterson had also been questioned in a large CES gathering by Lowell about the ban on the priesthood. Not in an attempt to shame them or anything. He was just like, help me understand the logic of this premortal judgment that you're referring to. It doesn't seem to make sense, and I don't see how it works. I don't know how you can tell somebody, say that somebody receives conditions or consequences of an action that they have no opportunity to repent for because they don't even remember it. Like this doesn't make any sense. And of course, again, the church is sort of sided with Lowell on that those explanations didn't make sense. So he was willing to ask honest questions, but he was not willing to make, again, this goes back to what we started with, this idea of ideas were not so important to him as practices. And as a disciple of Christ, his cause was serving Christ. It wasn't anything else. And so, if these other things became too important, then they were going to distract him.
It does draw a contrast for me, at least the way I'm hearing it, between him and Gene England, who, at least the way I read Terrell's book, the way that I felt it, he sort of painted it was that Gene had this sort of like really sort of deep need for the brethren to approve of him and to sort of sanction him. And he didn't get that because his ideas, I mean, in many ways, I feel like his ideas aligned to a great extent with Lowell Bennion's. But he was constantly, sending them to general authorities and getting pushback, and then, continued sort of ostracization and marginalization. And that seemed to really affect him. It became like a big part of his life and his story. And it seems to me like that's a contrast, that there was a difficult episode for Lowell, but that is sort of eventually rolled off his back. Am I hearing that?
Yeah, I think that's accurate with regard to Lowell. I mean, I can't speak to all the explanations about Gene's experiences. I read Terrell's book with great interest and noted that story with, as you described it. I think, I kind of read between the lines that David O. McKay himself did not offer Lowell an explanation for why he had been let go at the University of Utah. And that had to have hurt deeply because they had been close friends and associates. Lowell could request a private meeting with him and get one, and to not get a response must have been very painful. But he just, was absolutely determined not to let that stop him. And so he didn't, as far as I know, he never talked about it again. He never wrote about it. He never ruminated about it. And like I said, he did express regret to his own children that when the biography was released right at the end of his life, that this would somehow, recycle all of that sort of paradigm of him being this martyr of an institution that he loved that turned its back on him. And he served as a bishop late in his life, and it was a very incredibly inspiring story of a Christian to my mind. And even when the priesthood ban was lifted, he was interviewed and asked if he felt vindicated, and he was like, he was totally uninterested in vindication. He said, I've got other things to worry about.
Wow.
I mean, I'm glad it happened, but I'm not going to spend my time saying, hey, I told you so.
Yeah. What the only story about Lowell Bennion that I knew before reading this book was the short anecdote about him having that meeting with President McKay and talking about the woman who was being kept from her temple ceiling because of the priesthood ban. And so I would love for you to tell that story, because I didn't know if that was like Mormon folklore, like did that really happen? And it was really beautiful to read more of the details. So I'd love to hear the story, but also like talk to us about how he saw his role as a disciple who sustains leaders, because it felt so clear that he was coming at these difficult conversations where there was a lot of tension with full confidence that he was part of the conversation, not that he was a detractor in any way, or that he was being unfaithful. It seemed like he was invigorated by this idea that sustaining looked like having a meeting and raising your hand and offering another point of view or arguing a little bit. And I think that's something that probably feels relevant to people now. Like can feel like a moral dilemma. Like, does sustaining look like conformity, or does sustaining look like speaking your conscience? And it seems like that's something he was navigating through his entire life with really a lot of energy from the very beginning. It just like he never seems to have the energy of tiptoeing. It seemed like he felt a lot of conviction about bringing up these issues because he's a disciple, because he's a believer.
Yeah. Lots to say, and let me hope if I get off topic, keep me. Okay. There's just a lot to say in response to that. I mean, first of all, it's important to recognize that he was entirely persuaded by the restored gospel's account of human dignity, right? That we were intelligences before we were spirit children, that there's something eternal in us, that there is a divine potential in all of us, and that this is the most radical articulation of human dignity in human history. I mean, he just absolutely adored that concept of the restored gospel. And so for him, the dignity of the individual and the individual's journey toward a kind of flourishing, not only in this life, but in the eternities, is what all of us should be committed to, right? That's the purpose of the gospel. It's the purpose of the institution of the church, to bring those principles to people to help them to flourish. So as a student of bureaucracy, as a student of Max Weber, he understood that institutions often protect themselves and seek their own self-interest as institutions at the expense of individuals. That's actually a natural consequence of most any institution. But he wasn't cynical about institutions. He believed in them. He was an institution man. He worked in government at the end of his life in the civic sphere. He worked for a university. He worked for a church. He believed in the church. He believed in the good that institutions can do, but he knew that they needed people who were committed to those principles, right? And if the institution is vacated by people of goodwill and good hearts, then of course it will only get worse. And he did. I mean, people asked him toward the end of his life, why didn't you leave? Because I guess the assumption being you had enough negative experiences or enough reasons that you could have. He believed in the institution and the good that it could do. So that said, it's a different time when, your father is friends with general authorities and he had him over for dinner and so on. And then David O. McKay becomes a trusted mentor to him. So in this case of a student, I think it was a female student who found out as she was about to get married that she had African ancestry, but it was a brother of hers, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, who was also going to get a temple ceiling. And he was being told that he couldn't do it. And so this is a very individual case. It wasn't about the band as a whole, although that, of course, became the content of their discussion. And at one point, he recounts that David O. McKay kind of, rubs his forehead in angst and says, I worry so much about facing my father in heaven when all this is over and having to admit to him that I didn't do my due diligence as prophet of the church, that I failed him in any way. And Lowell immediately says to him, if you err on the side of mercy, I'm sure he'll be merciful to you. It's this beautiful moment, which was also, that was one of his, I guess, mantras. He was always talking about erring on the side of mercy. And in this individual case, of course, David O. McKay said, okay, and let this person go forward. But he did express to Lowell his own feeling that there was enough opposition in the top levels of the church leadership that he didn't see an immediate path forward yet. But it was an indication to Lowell that at least in David O. McKay's heart, he sensed that this policy needed changing, and that was reassuring to him. So, I mean, he talked about loving criticism, and that probably should be distinguished from loyal opposition, which is another phrase, and Elder Oaks has talked about that recently as sort of an unhelpful relationship to an institution. They're very, in my mind, they're very distinct concepts. There's no opposition in criticism implied, right? I mean, if I don't know a single bishop or a single Relief Society president who can do their job without somebody telling them that they're maybe missing something,
Yeah.
right? That's what councils are for. That's what counselors are for. That's what the lay structure of the church is built on, is that we give feedback to one another. The analogy I've used in another essay I wrote was, it's like trying to back a truck into a parking spot and imagine that I don't need somebody helping me to say, whoa, you're about to hit this. Bishop, you're about to hurt somebody.
Yeah.
Right? Because that happens all the time. So we're actually very familiar with what he was talking about. It wasn't this sort of grand, standing of oneself and of one's voice, but it was, using one's voice always for the benefit of the institution, doing its job better of blessing people, not doing the job of being an institution in and of itself, but doing the job of being an institution that is designed and built for the blessing of individuals.
Yeah.
And when those individuals are suffering in any way, we have the responsibility to say, or as he puts it also in the intellectual realm, if any interpretation of Scripture appears to denigrate the dignity of a human being or of a group of people, then I think we can logically conclude that that's the element of man in the revelation that we're not under any obligation to uphold. We should not be upholding theologies that are damaging to individuals, right? So that's anyway.
You did an excellent job with Aubrey's several-part question there. That was impressive. One thing you mentioned in there was what he saw as sort of the purpose of the church, and this is something Aubrey and I have been talking about and are actually trying to prepare for with another interview. But what did he see was the project of the church and the restoration? I think there are several competing ideas out there. One is potentially we're going to separate the sheep from the goats. One is, well, there will be some separation and we're dealing with the sheep and we're going to get them to the highest level of the celestial kingdom. Another, it sounds like that you're alluding to, is that this project is about human flourishing and it's our job to go into the world. But if that's it, what's the difference between our project as part of this restored church, and what's the difference between what we're doing in broader Christianity or just our duty as members of the human family? Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
Oh boy, there's a lot in that question. You guys are asking.
I'm trying to one up Aubrey. So.
Multi-pronged. She's like an octopus coming at me. I love that. I love that question. His simple formula was, people are the most important things in the universe. Mm-hmm. The gospel is the most valuable philosophy in the universe because of the way that it dignifies people. Oh, wow. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the best institution to bring that gospel to people. So that was his, it's why am I forgetting my scriptures? Moses 139?
Yeah.
To bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man, right? That's what he saw the church's purpose was. But he read those lines as not just about salvation, but about human dignity and well-being and flourishing on this earth now. And I think that's entirely consistent with Joseph Smith's teachings, with the restored gospel, that we are fully committed to, the moment of birth to death, to taking care of one another and ensuring well-being and relieving suffering and opening opportunities for people. So that includes everything from preaching the gospel to people, but it also means educating people. It means getting people access to healthcare. It means overcoming obstacles of prejudice and oppression in the world. It means building peace, right? Yeah. I mean, it's a social morality as well as it is oriented to the other world. I mean, to the degree, what's fascinating about Lowell is that he admitted openly that he was totally uninterested in salvation. And it wasn't because he wasn't concerned about living a good life. He was very concerned about that. And he taught that actively to his students, to people in welfare situations that he was working with. If they were struggling with an alcohol addiction or drug problem of any kind, he was all about trying to say there's a better way, there's a higher way. And he certainly taught that to us as boys at the ranch. But it wasn't. I at the time when I was in college and read this interview he did, where he said he was kind of uninterested in the celestial kingdom. All he said was, "I just want to be with Jesus, doing work with him." Which is the celestial kingdom, right? So he wasn't actually uninterested in it. Yeah. And as I've gotten older, I now sort of relate. I'm like, yeah, I'm not really anxious anymore about salvation. I'm more interested in trying to use the gospel for the purposes of human flourishing. So I
love that. It sounds like he was doing anything but dreaming of mansions above.
Well, he said very clearly, and I think we forget this, is that Jesus taught us that we should forget ourselves.
Yes.
So there's actually a tendency in religion, in Christian religion in particular, to obsess about ourselves.
Yeah.
Where am I today? How good am I today? And what are my chances now? And what about that person? Why is that person letting me down? Or why is that person doing something that I disapprove of? That's an entire waste of Christian energy. Yeah. It is not at all what the gospel is supposed to be about. So he was worried that if we focused exclusively on salvational ambitions, that we would forget ourselves, and it would instead reinforce a sense of our worth being connected to our ideas, or the rightness of our ideas, and the rightness of our practices, and not concerned about actually, helping people.
It's beautiful. You're reminding me so much of what he says about apologetics. Apologetics to him was a defensive and exceptionalist posture that sought to protect ideas, whereas theology, at least the kind that he tried to practice, could focus instead on moral relevance in a contemporary context. And it seems to me like those are often the choices that sort of arise if you're experiencing some sort of tension. There can be this impulse to lean on traditional apologetics to sort of reaffirm the correctness of your belief. Or I think that maybe an alternative that he sort of illuminates is that you can also turn toward service, because if you're putting it all into action, the small details seem a lot less important, because it really is about this it really is about the action that the theology is inspiring you to work on. And so I like that idea that like maybe service can be the antidote when you feel kind of nervous about wanting to be able to like pin down the very specific details of doctrine that seem obscure. And it seemed like he showed that just it feels a lot less important when you're going to be at a boys ranch or like doing the work of Jesus, as opposed to just like this real intense focus on reasserting to yourself the rightness of the details of your belief.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to diminish the importance of covenants. I don't want to diminish the importance of commandments at all. I think he was consistent in his views about the value of those things. But I think, I think that's one reason why we end up, tending to want to talk about. I don't know. I'm myself sort of uninterested. This is a really weird thing to say as a professional academic and writer, but I'm much less drawn to the conversation around ideas for its own sake than I used to be, and I'm much more tired and impatient with it, because and part of it is Lowell used to, if you complained about anything to him about something really specific at the ranch, or about America, or about the church, or whatever else you wanted to complain about, he would just look at you and say, well, what are you going to do about it? And it was like the end of the conversation. Like there was nothing else to say, but, well, I just want to complain with you about it. And I want to bond with you over our complaining. Can we just do that for a minute, please? I'm desperate here. And it was just, it was always this sort of practical, so that question is always popping up in my own head whenever I get too far down a road of cynicism or critical thinking. That's where the loving criticism that he talks about is so important. The loving dimension of it is, I have to contribute something. So if I see my bishop doing something that I don't like, what am I going to do about it? Is there a way I can exercise some influence there? And I know a lot of people say, well, I'm not in the bishopric, or I'm not this and that, so how can I do that? you're never going to find a more local community than a ward where you can actually walk right up to the guy who's in charge and say, I don't like this. You know, it takes courage, and we have to learn how to speak honestly. He has this wonderful quote that I quote at the beginning about, I'm convinced that most problems can be solved by just greater dialogue and more engaging with one another. We just can't walk away and burn bridges and say that person, because then we start telling ourselves narratives about that person can't hear me, doesn't care, that institution doesn't hear me, doesn't care, and then the whole thing is just broken, right? We've fragmented from one another, and we're no longer engaged in that relationship of trust where we're trying to figure this out together.
And I love like the perspective that the fact that you're noticing something wrong is a good thing, not a bad thing. It's not an indication that there's that there's brokenness that's like diminishing. It can mean that something about you and your perspective or your gifts are giving you something very valuable. That, you know, if you're seeing that the bishop is going to back into the tree, like that's not the end of the conversation. It's not about that your bishop is a bad driver. It's that like you're standing right there and you can see it, and like that's a gift that you have that perspective to share. And it seemed like he just really believed that it's a gift to notice when something.
And some of it's not speaking of it at all, right? I mean, sometimes what we need to do is just silently go and heal a wound, right? That we know maybe a particular individual is not going to be responsive to our concerns, or we've already tried and the hurt is still there. And then we just have to go dress wounds, right? We have to be nurses and heal people quietly and one at a time, rather than trying to, again, the impulse to sort of grandstand and make this into a rhetorical battle. It's not that he wasn't willing to call a foul, right, when something was wrong, but he was very suspicious that that had limited good, right, that could result if it was just a bunch of debates and talking and you know, arm wrestling one another.
And I would imagine too, I mean, when I think about this in very simplistic terms and sort of like seeing God look down on us and we're noticing, you know, something, we're on either side of this, but something's broken, something's wounded, needs to be fixed. I would imagine that God gets excited not just about the opportunity for it to be fixed or for it to be healed, but about the tension that is sort of necessarily going to be there in the fixing of it and in the healing of it. Like, would God get just as excited about the prospect of us having to go through the tension of talking with our bishop as the result of that talk? Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and that goes back to your question about sustaining. I think for him, sustaining was exactly that. It was sort of like, how do I add to the tools that are available to the institution to help solve the problems that it is dealing with, even if it doesn't see them all the time, or even if it in individual cases I can't seem to convince people of whatever, you know. And there's a tremendous amount of humility too in him, right? So that's a lesson for us, I think, is just, you know, willing to recognize that maybe I'm wrong, maybe my perspective is not accurate. But anytime that I cast a person or an institution or a group of people as sort of categorically this or categorically that, I'm condemning them, right? And it's also fueling contempt, and I don't, you know, I don't think that results in anything positive.
One of my very favorite parts of the book that I want to make sure we get to is when his understanding of repentance and what repentance looks like, and he says that. Or you write that it wasn't about greater obedience. It was about, or trying harder to be good. It was instead about expanding and taking greater advantage of the freedom of the soul to attach itself to things of value. Yeah. And that is an exhilarating understanding of repentance that I just love. So could you just talk about the way he taught that and the way he believed it?
Well, a little anecdote that happened to me at the ranch. I went to the ranch just 6 months after my oldest brother took his life as a senior in high school. I was a senior, he was in college, but I went to the ranch that first summer. And I was also like a reformed Latter-day Saint. I had been living a wasteful youth for a number of years, just kind of not sure who I was, what I believed in. And, you know, so I was a project for my bishop and others in the ward. And so I had only recently sort of put myself on the covenant path and said, okay, I'm going to try to be a serious Latter-day Saint, and I'm going to try to keep the commandments. And so it was all a big experiment. And then this, terrible tragedy happened to my family. And, things were happening simultaneously in my life at the time. I had been raised by parents who taught me great literature was valuable, great music was valuable. And so I went that summer with a cassette tape that a friend of mine who was a classical music lover had made for me of what was it, 45 minutes aside on a cassette tape. So it was an hour and a half of the greatest classical music he could come up with. I don't know, maybe I had more than one, but I also brought Brothers Karamazov with me and decided I was going to read it that whole summer. At the end of the summer, Lowell sent me my paycheck, and again, this is how brief he was, in words, terse. I just wanted like this nice long letter or something, and he just said, "Keep up your lusts for the fine things of life." That's all he said, and just like sent me the check and it was this little piece of paper with that. And I wish I still had it.
Yeah.
It was just meant so much to me, and I had never thought of lust in that way. I was like, I thought lust was a bad thing, and now it's like, oh, I can lust after natural beauty. I can lust after great music. I can lust after great literature. And that was such an important lesson for me in summer for me, because I was filling my life with good. And my capacity to resist temptation and overcome my weaknesses was immensely enhanced as a result. Like, it was such a miracle to me that I could embrace all this good stuff and not even feel like there was as much room anymore in my heart for, temptations or weaknesses. I mean, it wasn't like I got rid of them, but they were more manageable to me, and I felt more whole because I was filling my life. I wasn't just, I was cleaving unto good, not just forsaking all evil. And that, I think, was what he really wanted his students. He was very worried about perfectionism, which has only gotten worse, and anxiety, which has only gotten worse among young people. And the solution for him was always like serving other people and getting yourself onto an adventure.
Yeah.
You have a unique life to live. You have unique gifts. God gave them to you. God will open opportunities for you. You trust in him, and you magnify your talents, and trust in that process that will unfold over the course of your life, and you won't be bored. Yeah. Church won't be boring because you're going to be sitting around just going to meetings and worrying about whether or not anyone's going to remember to bring the brownies to the event on Wednesday night. And instead, you're going to be focusing on big picture stuff. And you probably are going to be so busy, not only serving in church, but serving in your community, that you don't have time for a lot of belly aching and complaining, or about just cynicism and loneliness, right? There's a sense of belonging and connection that comes through that I think young people today desperately need. We all need, especially, with social media and post-COVID, we're desperate for connection. And the gospel says, be anxiously engaged in a good cause. Like, it's not just about fulfilling your calling.
Yeah.
It's a lot more than that. And it should be exciting to you. It shouldn't feel like a burden. It should be an opportunity to find your creativity and use your best judgment.
I love what's the phrase he uses about facing temptation it's more effective to face temptation indirectly or something. It was just like, it was so short and sweet, and a great reminder that sometimes you pour energy into something that already feels very negative, and it becomes even more draining. And this just feels intuitively like such a great life outlook.
Yeah, no, it's the way my wife raised our kids. It's like if my kids made a mistake, I wanted to have this hour-long discussion about what was wrong with it and why they need to make me feel reassured that they won't make the mistake again. Exactly. And my wife was always just like, I see that you're misbehaving. Have you looked at this book?
Yeah.
And it was just all this sort of let's move over here and let's try not to whereas my impulse was to want to go into the details and make it far worse than it was. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, George, for some wonderful work. Thank you for honoring an incredible man, as reluctant as he would be to hear that, I'm sure. More importantly, thanks for bringing these ideas to light, and I think inspiring all of us to think about how we can show up in the world in a better way.
Thank you. Thank you for paying attention to it, and thank you for all the good that you guys do. I just think so highly of both of you, and so highly of what Faith Matters is doing, and
thank you.
Keep it up. good work.
Thanks, George.
Thank you so much. All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with George Handley. You can buy George's new book, Lowell Bennion, A Mormon Educator, on Amazon or wherever books are sold. And if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on. We read all of the reviews, and it really helps us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we appreciate the support. Thanks again for listening, and remember, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.